Have you ever talked to someone who's convinced that colonialism was actually a good thing for the colonized people? And if you have you ever wondered how best could you mount a critique of their views? So if you watch this video to the end, you will at least know 3 convincing answers to dispel any claims that colonialism was actually a good thing for the colonized people. So let's start. So what are the 3 pernicious legacies of colonialism that you can point to and explain to anyone who tries to suggest that colonialism was somehow a good thing? Number 1, colonizers and colonization systems worked through divide and rule. That's how they built what we call their hegemony. And in the process of doing that, they created and heightened ethnic, religious, and regional rivalries. And post-colonial nation-states are still beset with those ethnic, regional, and religious rivalries. So let's take the example of India, for example. To keep their system intact and make it functional, they pitted, first of all, Muslims against Hindus. These 2 groups obviously had their objective differences, but within the colonized system, those become subjectivized. And so the British use Muslims to undercut the Hindu majority, and similarly Hindus to undercut the Muslim interests, hence keeping both these large religious constituencies under control. And as a result, by the end of their colonial rule, the differences had become so huge that the Muslims actually opted to form a separate nation, which is now Pakistan, and of course Bangladesh, which used to be East Pakistan. The regional differences were also mobilized in terms of North and South India, the state identities, Punjabis versus Bengalis, Tamils, versus people from north of India. And those divisions still persist because people saw each other as these belligerent groups. They still, even though they live in the post-colonial nation state, have that history of distrust of their neighboring regional people, the state next door, the province north of them or south of them. And Pakistan feels the same way. The same things are experienced in terms of regional identities and competing regional identities. What happens when there are competing regional identities is that the chances of creating a larger, stable national narrative are diminished and become increasingly low. Now, if we go to the third aspect of this divide and rule, which is ethnic differences, you can clearly see within the Indian context that in the larger nation of India, which is current-day India, the southern ethnicities were used against the ethnic groups from the north. Similarly, if you look at current-day Pakistan, right, the Sindhi nationalists, those identities were heightened against those in Punjab. Northwest frontier, they create a separate myth of their own regional identities. Now, as a legacy of colonialism, these groups still see each other as opposing groups, as belligerent groups, as groups who distrust each other. Now, previously, the difference was that these ethnic identities existed before colonization, but they weren't mobilized in opposition to each other and not used as markers of inner group and outer group. So overall, one major pernicious legacy, dangerous legacy negative legacy of colonialism within the Indian context, but you can apply it elsewhere too, in Africa and the Caribbean. One major pernicious legacy is the ethnic, religious, and regional divides. If you want to expand it a little bit, how colonialism actually creates these hardened ethnic identities, look at Trinidad and Tobago. So first, the plantation owners imported people of African descent as slaves. When slaves are freed, they imported Indian workers, farmers and laborers from southern India. From the very instance when they introduced Indian workers, they of course took over the jobs what the freed slaves could have had. So an ethnic rift was created between these two groups. And still to this day, if you look at the politics of Trinidad, there are two major political parties. One is Afro-Trinidadian, the other is Indo-Trinidadian, and most of the times they are competing against each other because of the history introduced by the colonizers. So moving on to the second pernicious and negative legacy that the colonizers left is in terms of the administrative and justice systems. So let's look at the administrative system. During the colonial rule, the administration, the civil administration of different regions of the colony were top-down. Deputy collectors, the tax collectors, and the district administrators were centrally appointed. They were not answerable to the people, and they had the absolute power to control the region that was given to them. Now, this was done in case of India through the Indian Superior Services, where people who were educated in the English system were, of course, taken in. They would take a test, they would do an interview, and then they will be appointed. And their attitude then was more British than native. We have inherited the same system of administration. If you look at India, even at Pakistan, Bangladesh, we still have these civil servants, extremely powerful, centrally appointed, not answerable to the people, right? And they still run their districts and their regions as if they had absolute power and they were not answerable to the people. And that is a legacy that continues even now. Now, if you look at the justice system, most colonies retained most of the penal code that was introduced by the colonizers. But while in their own countries, France and England, they were developing a system of justice which was based in jury of the accused's peers, they never introduced the jury system in the colonies. So if you go to India or Pakistan, you always plead a case to a judge who is not elected by the people, but appointed by a government. And it's the judge who is the sole decider of any given case. There is no jury of the peers. But also, another aspect of it is that during the colonial time, it was considered contempt of court to criticize the judge. Right? Now, in England and in United States, you can say anything about justices. You can call them corrupt, you can call them incompetent, but in India, Pakistan, many other colonies, to say something against a judge is still a serious crime and can be punished in the court of law. So administratively speaking then, we are left with a legacy where our systems of administration of districts of different regions are still run by non-representative public servants who are more powerful in some cases than the elected representatives. And our justice system, especially how the courts are run and how the decisions are made, are still based in the same top-down colonial model that we had inherited. And so the problem then is that both these arms of the government are still undemocratic and non-responsive to the people. And this is a legacy that we have inherited from our colonizers. Now, moving on to the third negative impact of colonial policies is that in the process of running the colony, the European colonizers create a class divide. So they create an elite group and then the people. The elite groups are given lands, given property in return for their loyalty to the colonizers. Some of these elite groups were already landowners, and so they get exceptional power and more lands so that they can then keep the people under control, right? And make it possible for the colonizers to collect their taxes and collect whatever resources they want to collect. So while people are colonized, there is a cadre of people, rich, moneyed, who have land, who actually work against their own people because they are being propped up by the colonizers. Their sympathies are with the colonizers. Now, eventually, this becomes a system in which a top elite is created who arrogate to themselves this role of being the leaders and those who govern, and they still govern the people in the same undemocratic ways as they did during the colonial time. Now, this system is still intact in parts of India, parts of Bangladesh, parts of Pakistan, parts of Africa. The elite that were created by the colonizers still tend to be the richest people in the post-colony. And their view of their own people is still the same. They look down upon their own people. They try to control them. They try to make sure that people don't become highly educated or aware. If you need an example of it, Gayatri Spivak has a wonderful description of it when she talks about her summers spending time in the rural elementary schools. And because she was teaching the students through the teachers a habit of thinking critically about their own lives, that process became so threatening to the local landholders, right, to the local zamindars, that they insisted that that should be stopped. So that is the third pernicious legacy that keeps on impacting lives in the colony. So let us sum up. One pernicious legacy of colonialism is the ethnic, regional, and religious divides that were heightened during colonialism and that still persist in the post-colonial nation-states. Number two, the non-representative and undemocratic administrative and justice systems that were introduced during the colonial time still persist in the post-colonies. Number three, the elite and people divide that was created intentionally to create a local elite who can control the people still in one way or the other persists, and these are the elite who still run for office and who become powerful people within their nation states. So, if you ever have to argue with someone who's convinced that colonialism was actually a good thing, these are some of the points that you could discuss with them. Now, as an extra, let me point to one of the most important books that could help you figure out how these legacies are still operative and how do they impact the politics of the post-colony, and that is Echele Memembe's wonderful book on the post-colony. One of the concepts that he theorizes in that or talks about is the habits of democracy. Now, I have a video on it, which you can also watch. But what he's talking about is that since in colonial structures, the system is top-down and undemocratic, people learn that as the operative political system, and they do not develop the habits of democracy. What are those? Thinking of themselves as empowered, thinking of themselves as the real owners of the country, thinking in the best interest of the country itself. All of these are civic and political habits of living in a democracy. Those do not develop during colonialism. So that's all I had to share with you today. I hope this was useful to you. If you have a few more minutes, just take a look at the playlist that would come up. It's on post-colonial studies, and it has so many videos that could be useful to you just for your personal knowledge, but also for your academic work. Thank you so much. Stay safe, take care, and I'll now see you next time. Until then, peace and love.